So we move on to Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37, which is here exclusive to Mark. No other evangelist has this miracle. This is one of the two miracles in the Gospel of Mark in which Jesus uses external methods. And the external methods which Jesus uses here are that he puts his fingers into the ears of the man, he spat and touched his tongue, and he even cries ephphatha, which is an Aramaic term, which Mark translates into Greek as be opened. Why does Jesus use external methods? It seems very clearly that because Jesus is in Gentile territory, he wants to use that method which those in that area would understand. Today, we call this inculturation. As a matter of fact, with Jesus, it came naturally. There is a phrase in English which says, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Now, this can be applied to any country or any city in the world. When you are in that particular place, when you are in that particular situation, you must respond in a manner which people will understand. Otherwise, your work might be wonderful work. What you say might be exceptional in its content. And yet, if you speak in a country where they speak one language, but you use another language, nobody will understand, no matter how eloquent you are, no matter how content filled your delivery and your presentation is. So Jesus is in Gentile territory. Very clearly, we have seen that Jesus did not even use external methods in order to raise the daughter of Jairus. The woman with the flow of blood touched him, had faith, and was healed. Jesus could just heal the Syrophoenician woman's daughter even from a distance. So it seems clear that Jesus would not have needed to use external methods, but he does use external methods in order that those who are around would understand. The fact that they brought him a deaf man is an indication that there were others around also. And because there were others around, Jesus takes the man aside privately. And there are a variety of interpretations as to why this is private. In my opinion, the secret of healing seems to be the most logical reason. So the Hellenistic faith healers would do the same thing. They would take the person who was sick aside and deal with that person away from the crowd. So even though others have said that Jesus wants to be alone with the man, still others have talked about the messianic secret, which comes a little later. And possibly to avoid curiosity seekers, it seems to me that the main reason why Jesus takes the man aside is in order that those who would healing in that particular area would want to maintain the secrecy of what they did. So acting in a certain sense exactly like the faith healers of that area would act. So Jesus could reach out to them not only through the miracle, but also through the method. We must keep this in mind if we are to reach out to the people that we are working with. All too often, our message is excellent. All too often, what we have to say is good, but yet what happens is the manner in which we communicate it sometimes, the method that we use is not understood by those to whom we are communicating. And if that is the case, no matter how content filled our presentation is, no matter how eloquent we are when we speak, people will not understand a word of what we say, and their lives will therefore not be touched in any way simply because they did not understand. The looking up to heaven is to be interpreted as praying, asking God for aid, asking God for help, even though Jesus does not make any prayer. Just the look is an indication that Jesus realizes that God is the one through whom he will do the work of healing. And like Jesus earlier on gave commands to the sea, be still or be calm, here he simply gives a command to the ears of the man to be opened and also the tongue to be loosened. And so in one command, ephata, both these happen. The man's ears are open and his tongue was released and he spoke openly. Now, Jesus then commands them to silence. And basically, the reason for this command to silence again seems very strange. There are so many people around. They have brought the man who is deaf with an impediment in his speech to Jesus. So, how is it that Jesus can command them to silence? Does it make sense logically? We must keep in mind that as far as Mark is concerned, there is no logic in the command to silence. If you look for logic, you are misinterpreting the command to silence. So, in other words, it is sometimes, not always, but sometimes so illogical that you will be surprised and say, but why? And this is what Mark wants us to do. He wants us now here to ask the question. For example, we saw the first time in the case of the leper went and proclaimed it. Here, Jesus ordered them to tell no one. And again, notice, Mark is saying, even though he ordered them, the more he ordered them, the more zealously they, notice they, not only the man who was deaf and now could hear, the man who couldn't speak well and now could speak, but also possibly the ones who brought him because they experienced the miracle. So by telling us this, Mark is indicating that the command to silence is much, much more than seen on the surface level. Jesus not only does not want to be known as someone who could heal a deaf man with an impediment in his speech, or as someone who could do all the mighty works that he did. That is one part. But the second part also is how then Jesus wants to be known. We must keep both these in our view if we are to interpret the command to silence in the correct manner, in the manner in which Mark intended. One way is to say, yes, Jesus did not want to be known as a miracle worker. He did not want to be even known as a man who could do mighty deeds. He did not want to be known as an eloquent speaker. He did not want to be known even as someone who could raise people from the dead. That's one aspect of the command to silence. And then the second aspect, which we will soon ask, is then how did Jesus want to be known? When both these are put together, then we interpret the command to silence in a manner in which Mark possibly intended it. The response of the people, obviously, is to be astounded. And even though I use the word obviously, I am using the word obviously only because these who brought the man would have expected that Jesus would reach out. We have seen that there are cases when even a person who is unwell, a person who cannot speak and cannot hear, is able to speak and hear because of Jesus' intervention. There are some who are not astounded beyond measure. Here it is obvious because the ones who come and bring the man seem to be open to whatever revelation Jesus makes. And that is why their interpretation is, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. The next scene in the 3rd chapter of this Galilee section is the second feeding miracle. This feeding miracle is found only in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Luke and John do not have this feeding miracle in their Gospels. Notice the fact that Mark has mentioned this or wants to include this as a second feeding miracle is clear from the point which Mark makes, namely in those days when there was again. So Mark has not forgotten the earlier feeding miracle, even though the disciples seem to have forgotten it. By using this Greek word palin again, Mark is indicating, yes, I am aware in chapter 6 or earlier in my gospel, I did narrate one feeding miracle, but here I'm telling you there's another. Now, very clearly in Mark, not in Matthew, even though Matthew has copied this miracle from Mark, Matthew has made very, very significant changes, so much so that in Matthew's gospel, it does not become clearly a Gentile feeding. In Mark's, it is very, very, very clearly, without any doubt whatever, a Gentile feeding, but not in Matthew. Even though strangely, Matthew has included this miracle in his gospel. Why does Matthew change so many things to make it again a second Jewish feeding miracle? Possibly because he wants to show Jesus as reaching out again and again and again to the chosen people, and they're rejecting him again and again and again. In the Gospel of Mark, so very clearly, there is a great crowd, and Mark mentions this to us, and we are told. Now, what does Jesus have here? He has compassion. Why? Because they have been with him for 3 days. So the whole background is different. We might remember in the earlier feeding miracle, he did have compassion. But why? Because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. So the chosen people can be taught. And as far as Mark is concerned, the focus here is not so much the teaching, because there is no teaching now. The fact that they have been with him for 3 days is an indication that he has taught them in those 3 days. Otherwise, they would not continue to be with him. It is also likely that they possibly had food with them, and now the food is over. And so how are they going to be fed? This phrase, some of them have come from a great distance, is very, very indicative of the Gentiles. And Mark uses this phrase to indicate this. As far as Mark is concerned, the feeding now is a Gentile feeding, and this is what Mark is going to make very clear. So the compassion of Jesus, the concern of Jesus is shown very, very clearly in his not wanting to send them away, and in his interpretation, if you like, of what will happen to them. So he knows that they simply cannot go back to their homes without him providing something. Here, the disciples are not sarcastic. The disciples are logical, but in their logic, they put a dampener, they put a limit, they put a block, they put an obstacle to what Jesus can do. So this misunderstanding, which we talked about right at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, becomes so strong here. They were those who experienced the first miracle. As a matter of fact, we remember that Jesus, in the first miracle, like here, gave the bread to them to give to the people. So they know that. They also were ordered to collect the leftovers. And when we were told there were 12 baskets, it seemed very likely that all the 12 were involved in the collection. And so their question, even though logical, puts a block, puts a dampener, puts an obstacle. The Markan Jesus, unlike the Matthian Jesus, needs to be told and needs to ask a number of questions. And so he asks them, how many loaves do you have? Notice the focus is hardly on the fish. And that's why some see there is a sort of intuition about the Eucharist already here. Because when the breaking of the bread at the Last Supper at the Passover, it is basically loaves and fish is not mentioned at all. 7, when compared with the 5 of the previous feeding, make a total of 12. And so Mark is possibly indicating this 12. Now, what does Jesus do? Jesus makes the crowd sit down. Once again, a different verb is used, not the verb of the Jewish reclining. However, here also, the people recline. So Mark uses a sort of Gentile term for reclining. If in the earlier miracle, Jesus eulogein said the blessing, here it is Eucharistein. It might be stretching it a little far to indicate or to say that Jesus celebrated the Eucharist with the Gentiles here already in his lifetime. Just simply the word of giving thanks may not allow us to interpret that, but we also realize that Mark has deliberately used here a different verb, Eucharistein, when earlier it was eulogein. Likely because of the blessing and his wanting to bless the chosen people, Mark uses eulogein there in the first feeding miracle and Eucharistein here in the second feeding miracle. Here also, the disciples notice, and here we can see the compassion of Jesus, not only for the crowds, we can also see the compassion of Jesus for the disciples when he makes them his helpers. So we notice the people of his hometown, chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, had put a dampener, and Mark very strongly told us there, and Jesus could do no mighty work. Here, they put a dampener, and yet Jesus can perform because the disciples are insiders. It is their lack of understanding, it is their lack of faith, not their closed attitude. They are not closed like the outsiders are. To a person who is closed and will not respond with openness, nothing can be done. Which is the townspeople, which is the religious leaders of the time of Jesus. The disciples lack understanding. The disciples lack faith. The disciples pose obstacles, but the disciples are not closed. How do I say that they are not closed? When Jesus invites them to distribute the bread, they do that. They do that. And they distributed them to the crowd. And then notice, almost as an afterthought, Mark will say, they had also a few small fish. Because when Jesus sent them, he only asked them, how many loaves have you? Go and find out. And they go and find out. And only the loaves are mentioned. And later, when Mark says, okay, they didn't count the fish, so a few small fish. However, even though few small fish is mentioned, it seems likely that Mark wants to mention few because he wants to indicate that the loaves and the fish are more than at the first feeding miracle. At the first feeding miracle, there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. And 5 loaves and 2 fish were enough to feed 5,000 people. Here, 7 loaves more than 5 and few fish, surely more than 2, are required and can feed only 4,000 when compared. So when compared, this is a less abundant feeding. When compared, it is a feeding after the first feeding miracle. And we go back to what Jesus said to the Syrophoenician woman, Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30, when he said, let the children be fed first. However, the woman very clearly had said that the dogs are eating even as the children are eating. So even though there is a chronological element in this feeding, that is, it comes after the first feeding, we also know that as far as the Gentiles are concerned, through the woman's answer, that they can eat at the same time. 4 seems to indicate also the 4 points of a compass, the 4 corners of the earth. And then after the people are fed, they are sent away and they go away. In Mark, unlike in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, who have taken from Q and therefore have the signs, in Mark there is no sign which is going to be given to the people as far as Jesus is concerned. So Jesus gets into a boat. We remember, after the first feeding miracle, he sent his disciples away. Mark chapter 6, verse 45. He sends his disciples away in the boat and he goes to pray. Here, Mark does not show Jesus as praying because Mark likes threes. He has already shown Jesus praying twice. Mark chapter 1, verse 35, Mark chapter 6, verse 46, and later in chapter 14, verses 32 to 42, he will show him praying for the third and the last time. However, even after this feeding miracle, Jesus makes his disciples get into a boat and go to the district of Dalmanuta. So he moves away and Jesus possibly accompanies his disciples. He got into the boat and with his disciples went. Maybe he did not feel the need for prayer, or maybe because he received already the answer after the first feeding miracle, he knew what he had to do. And then this group, you might remember, they've encountered them very often. One of the religious groups come to Jesus and ask for a semeion. The Synoptic Gospels never refer to a miracle as a sign, though John's Gospel refers to miracles as signs. But the word sign, semeion, semeia, signs in John is used in a different way. When John uses, this was the first of the signs that Jesus worked, it was in Cana in Galilee. What he means by sign is that we must look beyond it. That is how John uses the word sign. So the sign is only a pointer, and look beyond it, look away from it. Don't get caught up, don't get stuck with the sign. Here, when Jesus is asked for a sign, sign is regarded in the synoptics because of the context, not by the word itself, but the context, it is a bad word. So what exactly is the meaning of sign here? How are we to interpret sign here? Would be confirmation. Show me. I want to see. Now, if I am calling you to faith, and if you were asking me to show you, where is the faith? Somebody said so beautifully, and it summarizes what is being said here. For those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who do not, no proof is sufficient. I repeat, for those who believe, no proof is necessary. For those who do not, no proof is sufficient. This is why I believe that Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit. Mark is unafraid of showing the emotions of Jesus, and this sighing in his spirit is to say that there is nothing more that he thinks that he can do. And his rhetorical question, more than a question seeking an answer, is why? Every sign that is required has been given to this generation, and no sign can be given now because you have closed your mind and heart. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 to 10, they will see and refuse to look. They will hear and refuse to understand. And then what can you do if that is the case? And then he left them and he went to the other side. Now, here, the mention of the other side is not simply the physical side, but also away from them, opposite of them. In other words, to a place where there will be no demand for a sign. We come to the last part of the third chapter of the Galilee section, which is the conflict. And the conflict here is created by the disciples. And the conflict here is created by the disciples, and when they are in the boat. The disciples, we are told, had forgotten to buy any bread. So notice, by mentioning bread here, very clearly, Mark is indicating that there must be a connection between the first feeding miracle and the second feeding miracle. They had one loaf. What does they had one loaf mean? Possibly, even though Mark doesn't use this beautiful metaphor, they had the bread of life. So some think they had Jesus with them in the boat, and they ought not to have worried, especially when they collected 7 baskets from just 7 loaves and few fish. So it shows the obtuseness of the disciples. It shows that it was so difficult to penetrate their minds and their hearts. And yet, because of their openness, Jesus continues on and on and on. However, he teaches them about what exactly their challenge is. He said, watch out for the yeast of 2. That is the yeast of the Pharisees, by which he would mean false piety. Jesus would have accused the Pharisees of a show, external show, only what is seeming. People look at me and they are inspired, they are impressed because of my external show, but inside I am nothing. So the false piety and the yeast of Herod, not the Herodians, but the yeast of Herod, who was godless, who behaved in a godless manner, and a godless manner where I make myself God. Selfishness, self-centeredness. I take my brother's wife as my own wife, even when my brother is still alive. And so when Jesus speaks about the influence, basically yeast would refer to influence of the Pharisees. So don't become an individual who will make prayers for show, who will give alms for show, who will do things merely to show people. Just follow the external law. No, let the law be followed from within. They think that he's telling them about yeast. They interpret yeast, which is leaven, in a literal manner. And they said to one another, it is because we have no bread. He's telling us you should have been aware of that. So you notice the disciples are interpreting on a literal manner, and then Jesus has got to ask them, or rather be literal himself. Why are you talking about having no bread? You see, it seems so funny, and you must see the humor in this situation when Jesus, such an eloquent speaker, such a wonderful teacher, made things so simple, where Mark will tell us he went about among the villages teaching, so people possibly understood it there. People have been with him for 3 days, very likely because they were looking at him as someone who gave them some valuable teaching in a manner in which they could understand. And so Jesus now has got to literally ask his disciples, why are you talking about having no bread? And then the question we might remember, which Mark, as the narrator had told us in chapter 6, verse 52, their hearts were hardened. Once again here, he puts the question on the mouth of Jesus, in the lips of Jesus. Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? And we notice very, very importantly for us to understand, we notice and ask ourselves, what is the focus of the question? Before Jesus can give the questions to which he wants answers. There are a number of things that he says, and we must be attentive to them. What are the questions which he said? Why are you talking about having no bread? So very clearly, this seems to me a rhetorical question. That is, the question is, I'm not discussing about bread. Very clearly, why are you talking about having no bread must be interpreted as, I am not discussing bread now first. Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Are you sure that you are open and not close your hearts like the outsiders? Ask yourself this question. Are you willing to listen? Are you willing to listen and hear? Do you have eyes and fail to see it? Remember the Isaiah text in the parable discourse. Do you have ears and fail to hear? So are you closing yourself? And then he asks them to remember. Remember is not simply the memory, no. When we remember at the Eucharistic celebration, it is not a memory, it is a making present. So he asks them when he says, and do you not remember? He's asking them to make present. What is he asking them to make present? He's asking them to make present through his questions, the remains. Notice the question. When I broke the 5 loaves, so the answer is already given. The 5 loaves is not the answer. For the 5,000 is not the answer. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? So we notice 5 loaves is not the answer. The fish have been forgotten. 5,000 is not the answer. What is the answer is how many baskets full. Now notice, they said to him 12. So they know the answer. And the second question, which also seeks an answer, and the 7, their answer is given, the 7 loaves are given as the answer. The 4,000 is not the answer. How many baskets full? So whether it is the first feeding, the Jewish feeding, or the second feeding, the Gentile feeding, in both of them, the focus is on the remains and not on the majestic number. This is why Jesus refuses to give a sign, because there is no magic. It should not be seen as a miracle. It can be seen as a mighty work. It can be seen as God's power. And then a very, very poignant question. Do you still not understand? Do you not yet understand? And we begin to ask ourselves, will the disciples really understand? This is the second of the 2 miracles only, and both in the Gospel of Mark, in which Jesus uses external methods. Very clearly, we shall see that the reason here is different. When we go through the text, then we can understand what Mark's reason is for using the external methods here. Like chapter 7, verses 31 to 37, this miracle is exclusive to Mark and not found in either Matthew or in Luke. We might remember that Bethsaida, and that's what I spoke about earlier when I talked about Mark's geography, that Bethsaida was that place to which they were supposed to come, and now they come to Bethsaida. So therefore, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man. We notice that some people had brought the deaf man with an impediment in his speech, that the friend of the paralytic had brought the paralytic friend also to the roof. Now, some people brought a blind man. And what did they do? They asked that Jesus touch the blind man. By this, obviously, they meant that he would heal the blind man. Like in the earlier case, Jesus took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. At the end of the section of the way, we will come across the healing of blind Martinius. And the healing of blind Martinius is done without any external methods. Jesus calls Martinius. He simply asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" Martinius says, "Rabbi, that I might see." And he says, "Receive your sight, and your faith has helped you." So very clearly, it is not required for Jesus in order to be able to do what he does here. However, here the reason is slightly different. Taking the man by the hand and leading him out of the village, the external gesture is an indication that Jesus now is still in Gentile territory, or there are Gentiles around, or the people who brought him, because this is an indication. However, more than that, there is a much deeper meaning here, as we shall see in a few moments. So while it could be for privacy, Jesus took the man aside. The first treatment which Jesus does, it is with saliva. Saliva was believed to have healing properties, and that's why earlier also Jesus uses saliva on the man's tongue. Here, saliva is put on the man's eyes, because there it was, the man could not really speak, and the fingers were put in the ears. Here it is the eyes. He cannot see with his physical eyes, and so the hands are laid on him and the saliva is put on his eyes. The only miracle in which Jesus asks a question, and you notice, by having this as the only miracle, Mark is saying something more to us, which you must try to see what he is saying. So Jesus asked the question, and the man cannot see clearly. We can term this response of the blind man as unclear sight. He sees people moving, but they look like trees. Now, there is a second level of treatment, a second line of treatment required. The man, Jesus lays his hand. This time there is no saliva. He simply lays his hands on the man again. And then we are told he looked intently and his sight was restored. Jesus doesn't ask him a second question, but he saw everything clearly. Now this, sending the man away home, saying, "Do not even go into the village," is because in the practice of folk medicine, connected with the secret of healing, and here may possibly, not definitely, may possibly be also connected with the messianic secret. Earlier, whenever Jesus did not want someone to mention it, he told that person explicitly about it. Here, this possibly reflects the practice of folk medicine more than ultimately it is the messianic secret, not so much the messianic secret. And so, very clearly, as we will see, the two stages of the blind man's healing, where he sees people like trees, is connected with the text that we will see later.